Hello, my friends. I want to begin this analysis by stating my conclusions plainly before walking through the evidence and reasoning in detail. The current phase of the war demonstrates three converging realities. Russia is consolidating military superiority across key fronts. Ukraine is increasingly reliant on information warfare and provocation rather than battlefield initiative. And the United States, specifically President Trump, now clearly understands which party is obstructing diplomacy. Russian drone warfare and the shifting technological balance. Russia's elite drone unit, Rubicon, has recently released footage demonstrating deep, long-range FPV strikes conducted well inside Ukrainian territory with geolocations, confirming ranges of up to 200 kilometers. This is a significant development. Until now, Russia had established dominance in short and medium-range drone warfare, roughly up to 40 or 50 kilometers, while Ukraine retained an advantage in long-range FPV operations, particularly evident in strikes against Crimea. What we are now witnessing is a balancing, if not a reversal, of that advantage. Russia is clearly adapting its systems, whether through relay drones, ground-based repeaters, or coordinated multi-platform architectures. The result is unmistakable. Russian drone superiority is no longer confined to the tactical front line. It now extends deep into Ukraine's rear. The alleged drone attack on Putin's residence, reality versus effect. The claim that approximately 90 drones targeted one of President Putin's residences has dominated headlines. Whether this incident actually occurred, whether it was exaggerated, or whether it was entirely fabricated, is almost secondary. What matters strategically is perception. Specifically, what matters is what President Trump believes happened. President Trump publicly stated that he learned of the alleged attack directly from President Putin. He expressed anger and emphasized that attacking a leader's residence during delicate negotiations is unacceptable. This reaction alone changes the strategic equation. Trump referenced Tomahawk missiles and thanked God that the United States had not supplied them to Ukraine. Russian sources later confirmed similar statements were conveyed to Putin's aides. The implication is clear. Trump is reassessing Ukraine's reliability as a negotiating partner. From Russia's perspective, this incident, real or not, works entirely in Moscow's favor. It reinforces the narrative that Ukraine is reckless, provocative, and unwilling to engage in serious diplomacy. Zelensky's response and the collapse of diplomatic credibility. Zelensky immediately dismissed the incident as a Russian fabrication designed to justify further strikes. He insisted Ukraine does not undermine diplomacy. This claim rings hollow. Over the past 4 years, it has been European actors more than Russia who have repeatedly sabotaged diplomatic efforts. Zelensky's recent public statements and tweets stand in direct contradiction to Trump's rhetoric, suggesting that behind closed doors, the tone of discussions was far harsher than what was shown publicly. He understands why Russia does not want a ceasefire. Any strategist with even a basic understanding of warfare should grasp this. A ceasefire benefits the side that has lost momentum, not the side advancing. If Ukraine were advancing and Russia requested a ceasefire, Ukraine would rightly reject it. Zelensky's insistence on a 60-day ceasefire followed by a referendum is strategically incoherent. A referendum means nothing unless both sides have already agreed to the framework. Otherwise, it becomes a delaying tactic, nothing more. The Donbass, referendums, and strategic reality. Zelensky continues to frame Russian objectives as fantasies, claiming Russia wants Ukraine not to exist. This rhetoric ignores reality. Russia has demonstrated militarily that it can take the territory it claims. More importantly, Trump's position aligns closer to Moscow's than Kyiv's. Ukraine must withdraw from remaining portions of the Donbass. Calls for referendums without security, without agreed terms, and without Russian participation are meaningless. War is not democratic. A limited referendum restricted to those fighting or eligible to fight would be more legitimate than allowing distant civilians or profiteers to dictate outcomes. Battlefield developments, Zaporizhia, and the Southern Front. Turning to the battlefield, Russian advances around Hulaypol mark a decisive shift. Multiple independent mappers, including pro-Ukrainian analysts, now acknowledge that Russian forces have effectively seized the city, opening a critical logistical corridor towards Zaporizhia. The Ukrainian defensive lines, designed for a south to north advance, are now being systematically outflanked east to west. Fortifications are irrelevant without manpower, and Ukraine simply does not have sufficient forces to man them effectively. Russian operations are textbook: capture logistics hubs, consolidate supply routes, accumulate forces, and then advance. The capture of Velika Novosilka and subsequent breakthroughs demonstrate this methodical approach. The notion that Zaporizhia can be held indefinitely is fantasy. Russian forces are shaping the battlefield to eventually crush the city against the Dnipro River, rendering Ukrainian defenses untenable. Northern and central fronts, pressure without overextension. In the north, Russian advances around Kreminna, Lyman, and adjacent sectors continue steadily. These are not dramatic breakthroughs, but they do not need to be. Russia is widening its operational base, reducing exposure to concentrated Ukrainian fires, and forcing Kyiv to spread dwindling manpower across multiple axes. This is strategic attrition, and Russia is winning it. The sinking of the Ursa Major, a covert act of hybrid warfare. One of the most underreported yet strategically significant events of the war was the sinking of the Russian cargo vessel Ursa Major near Cartagena. At the time, the lack of imagery, conflicting explanations, and rapid suppression of information suggested foul play. A year-long Spanish investigation has now confirmed what many suspected: this was not an accident. The vessel was carrying components consistent with two VM-4SG nuclear reactors, compact military-grade systems designed for icebreakers, auxiliary naval vessels, submarines, or mobile power generation. These reactors were likely destined for North Korea, potentially as part of a technology exchange following agreements between Putin and Kim Jong-un. The hull was pierced from the outside in a signature incompatible with engine room explosions and consistent with a supercavitating torpedo. Such weapons are possessed by Russia, China, and several NATO states. This operation fits a familiar pattern, carried out by a few, enabled by many. Plausible deniability. Exactly as seen with Nord Stream, Russia's subsequent actions deploying military vessels, deploying flares to blind satellites, and conducting seabed inspections indicate damage control, not exploitation. If this were a Russian false flag, it would have been exploited aggressively. It was not. This suggests the operation was designed to prevent strategic technology transfer, nothing more, nothing less. Strategic implications. The Arctic, nuclear icebreakers, mobile reactors, and logistics dominance are all central to future power competition. Russia leads in this domain. Attempts to sabotage that led, whether via covert maritime attacks or sanctions, have not altered the trajectory. The Ursa Major incident underscores a broader reality. The war in Ukraine is no longer confined to trenches and artillery. It is global, covert, and strategic. Final assessment: Russia holds the initiative militarily, diplomatically, and strategically. Ukraine is increasingly isolated, reliant on provocation and information warfare rather than battlefield success. President Trump understands this, and his recent statements reflect a fundamental shift in U.S. posture. The war will not end through fantasies, slogans, or staged provocations. It will end on terms dictated by battlefield reality, and that reality overwhelmingly favors Russia. The military situation in Ukraine at this stage of the conflict can no longer be described as fluid, contested, or uncertain. It has entered a terminal phase. What we are witnessing in late 2025 is not a temporary setback for Kyiv, not a pause before some miraculous reversal, but a cascading collapse driven by strategic exhaustion, operational failure, and political self-deception at the highest levels of the Ukrainian state and its Western sponsors. The recent meeting between Vladimir Putin and General Valery Gerasimov was not a symbolic event, nor was it a theatrical exercise for domestic consumption. It was a confirmation briefing. The Russian general staff was not seeking guidance, it was reporting results. The tone, the content, and the subsequent public statements all point in one direction. Moscow believes the decisive phase of the war has already been won, and what remains is the methodical liquidation of residual Ukrainian resistance. Let us be clear about the geography and the operational facts. The Russian armed forces now control Pokrovsk, Mirnorod, and Rodinsky. This is not speculation. This is not propaganda. This has been confirmed by extensive battlefield footage, visual confirmation, flag raisings, and most tellingly by reluctant admissions from Ukrainian-aligned analysts themselves. Once these three nodes fell, the southern flank of Sloviansk was effectively unhinged. The notion that Ukrainian forces could maintain a coherent defense of Donetsk after this point is fantasy. Sloviansk was always the final bastion in Donbass. Its strategic value was not symbolic, it was structural. With Sloviansk compromised, the entire Ukrainian defensive architecture in eastern Ukraine collapses inward. That is why Putin's remarks about Ukrainian withdrawal from Donetsk being meaningless were not rhetorical flourishes. They were statements of fact. Russia no longer needs concessions on territory. It is already in the process of occupying by force of arms. What follows logically and inevitably is the expansion of Russian operational demands westward. Buffer zones are no longer theoretical constructs. They are being actively discussed because they are being actively created. Sumy, Kharkiv, and potentially areas deeper toward the Dnieper are now part of the strategic calculus. Once Russian forces demonstrate the ability to operate freely east of the Dnieper, and they are doing exactly that, the river ceases to be a defensible line. Ukrainian logistics across the Dnieper are already under sustained Russian interdiction. Bridges are not lifelines. They are liabilities. The collapse in Zaporizhia further underscores the terminal nature of Ukraine's position. Huliaipol, a historically significant city and the second largest population center in the region under Ukrainian control, fell with astonishing speed. Weeks, not months. This was not the result of overwhelming Russian force alone. It was the product of Ukrainian morale failure. Units withdrew. Positions were abandoned. Resistance evaporated. This is the signature of an army that understands at some level that the war is already lost. Orikhiv, the launch point of Ukraine's failed 2023 counteroffensive, now faces encirclement. Stepnohursk is already compromised. The so-called Zaporizhia line has ceased to exist as a coherent defensive formation. Once again, Ukrainian denials ring hollow when contrasted with battlefield realities. Kyiv's obsession with Kupiansk is instructive not because of its military significance, but because of its psychological one. Ukrainian leadership trapped itself inside its own propaganda narratives. Having declared Kupiansk secure, Kiev felt compelled to perform security. Brigades were diverted. Counterattacks were staged. Zelensky himself appeared near the city in a transparent attempt to validate a story that no longer corresponded to reality. This was not strategy. It was theater. Meanwhile, decisive battles were being lost elsewhere. This pattern repeats itself because Ukrainian decision-making is no longer driven by military logic. It is driven by political survival and external optics. Zelensky's primary audience is no longer the Ukrainian general staff. It is Washington. Specifically, it is those factions within the U.S., political establishment, neoconservatives, and their European counterparts, whose sole remaining objective is to prolong the conflict regardless of the cost to Ukraine. The internal fractures are becoming visible. Intelligence Chief Kyrilo Budanov has begun to speak the truth, because intelligence agencies deal in realities, not narratives. His admission that Russia has mobilized hundreds of thousands of additional troops, that Russian forces are not exhausted, and that Ukraine is the weaker party in any negotiation is not accidental. It reflects what U.S. intelligence already knows. Weak states do not dictate terms to stronger ones. Wars of attrition do not end with moral victories. Zelensky refuses to absorb this reality. He continues to speak of ceasefires, referendums, and fantastical force expansions, while desertion rates soar and Ukrainian units disintegrate under pressure. Soldiers at the front understand what politicians refuse to acknowledge. There is no plan to win, and there is no strategy to end the war on acceptable terms. As a result, many are choosing not to die for illusions. This is how wars end, not with a dramatic surrender, but with accelerating decay. As Russian advances continue, the pace will increase. Attritional warfare always behaves this way. Once structural defenses fail, collapse compounds. Russia may pause briefly to consolidate gains, but the direction of travel is unmistakable. By winter's end and into spring, the remaining Ukrainian positions east of the Dnieper will become untenable. What replaces military strategy in Kyiv is political maneuvering, infighting, cabinet reshuffles, capital flight, desperate lobbying in European capitals, attempts to convince Washington that one more tranche of weapons, one more infusion of money, one more escalation will somehow reverse the irreversible. Western media, long complicit in sustaining illusions, will gradually adjust its tone, not out of courage, but out of necessity. Objectively speaking, Ukraine has lost this war. The fall of Myrnohrad, Pokrovsk, and Huliaipol makes that conclusion unavoidable. From this point forward, the only question is not whether Russia will win, but how fast the remaining Ukrainian state structures unravel and how much unnecessary suffering will be inflicted before reality is finally acknowledged. That is the strategic truth. Cold, unsentimental, and inescapable. What we are witnessing right now is not an isolated incident, not an accident of war, and certainly not a random event emerging from the so-called fog of war. The alleged Ukrainian drone attack on President Vladimir Putin's residence fits a pattern that anyone with even a rudimentary understanding of intelligence operations and strategic signaling should immediately recognize. The Russians claim that Ukraine attempted to strike Putin's residence in the Novgorod region, reportedly using a large number of unmanned aerial vehicles, all of which were intercepted by Russian air defense systems. Kiev, as expected, denies the entire episode, insisting that Moscow fabricated the story. At this stage, the factual truth is less important than the strategic function of the incident itself. Whether the attack occurred exactly as described or not, the event serves a clear disruptive purpose. Every single time serious diplomatic engagement begins, especially when the United States is involved, some form of destabilizing action emerges. These actions are designed to poison the negotiating environment, harden positions, and derail momentum. We have seen this repeatedly over the past 6 months. This incident belongs squarely in that category. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that Russia will revise its negotiating position following the alleged attack, while simultaneously emphasizing that Moscow does not intend to withdraw from talks with the United States. Lavrov's language is intentionally opaque. That ambiguity is deliberate. A revision can mean harsher terms, fewer concessions, or simply a colder, more rigid negotiating posture. The point is not clarity, the point is leverage. But let's be honest, the negotiations themselves have produced virtually nothing. Public declarations about progress ring hollow. We saw this clearly after the much publicized meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump. Both emerged claiming that peace is closer than ever, with Zelensky asserting that 90% of the terms have already been agreed upon. That claim collapses under even minimal scrutiny. There were no concrete announcements, no documented agreements, no substantive breakthroughs. Declaring progress without evidence is political theater, not diplomacy. Lavrov's warning that retaliation has already been planned, targets identified, timing decided should not surprise anyone. States do not issue such statements casually, but speculation about what Russia will strike is unnecessary. The strategic reality is simple. Russia does not need theatrical responses. Moscow operates on timelines that serve its objectives, not Western media cycles. Zelensky's reaction reveals far more than he likely intended. He immediately framed the incident as a Russian pretext to strike Kyiv, particularly government buildings. This is projection. Kyiv understands how pretexts work because it has relied on them extensively. Zelensky claims Russia only responds to pressure, yet this argument collapses when examined honestly. Western leaders routinely argue that Russia must be pressured into negotiations. Pressure, coercion, leverage, these are universal tools of statecraft. Zelensky's attempt to portray Russia as uniquely coercive is intellectually dishonest. The broader issue Zelensky avoids is that Ukraine's supposed diplomatic success depends entirely on sustained American involvement. The moment Washington signals fatigue or reassessment, Kyiv's position weakens dramatically. That is why any perceived alignment between Moscow and Washington, even rhetorical, causes panic in Kiev. Donald Trump's response to the alleged attack is revealing. He acknowledged that Putin informed him directly and emphasized that attacking a leader's residence crosses a line. His reference to Tomahawk missiles is not accidental. It is a pointed reminder of restraint, his restraint. Trump is signaling that certain escalation thresholds were deliberately not crossed during his tenure, despite constant pressure from interventionists. Trump also acknowledged uncertainty, leaving open the possibility that the attack never occurred. This matters. It demonstrates something the Western media rarely tolerates when discussing Russia: skepticism. Demanding evidence is acceptable only when directed at Moscow. When claims originate elsewhere, journalists suddenly lose interest in verification. This asymmetry is not accidental, it is ideological. Claims from the Kremlin that Trump has shifted his position toward Ukraine following the incident should be treated cautiously. Trump has boxed himself into a corner by portraying himself as the sole broker capable of ending the conflict. Walking away now would undermine that self-constructed narrative. Outrage, even if genuine, does not necessarily translate into policy reversal. Publicly, Trump showed no visible anger when questioned alongside Netanyahu. Anyone familiar with Trump understands that he does not conceal outrage when he wants to display it. The absence of visible fury matters. Zelensky's demand for 30 to 50-year U.S. security guarantees is perhaps the most revealing moment of all. This is not a peace proposal. It is an admission of strategic dependency. Such guarantees would institutionalize confrontation with Russia for generations. Whether 15 years or 50 is irrelevant, the precedent itself would be historic and profoundly destabilizing. Zelensky also inadvertently acknowledged a truth long denied in Western discourse. This war did not begin in 2022. By stating that the conflict has lasted nearly 15 years, he confirmed what analysts have said for over a decade, that the roots of this war extend back to earlier Western interventions, regime engineering, and NATO expansion. The narrative collapse is complete. Meanwhile, Europe faces the consequences of its own strategic malpractice. European leaders now openly admit that their industrial base is in crisis. They blame China, American tariffs, and implicitly Russia. What they refuse to acknowledge is the role of self-inflicted energy deprivation and regulatory suffocation. Industries do not collapse overnight. They erode through years of ideological policymaking detached from material reality. Calls for massive investment funds arrive too late. Without cheap energy and coherent industrial strategy, no amount of money will reverse decline. Europe once had access to stable, affordable energy. It chose ideology over pragmatism and now pays the price. The broader lesson here is unavoidable. The end phase of conflicts is often the most dangerous. As one side recognizes strategic defeat, discipline erodes and desperation increases. Disruptive incidents will not diminish, they will intensify. What we are seeing now is not chaos. It is the predictable outcome of prolonged denial. Russia understands this. Moscow is not improvising. It is managing escalation, signaling limits, and preserving strategic patience. The West, by contrast, reacts emotionally, rhetorically, and incoherently. That asymmetry will determine how this conflict truly ends.